Hello students, here we are, Chapter 4, Lesson 3, Life in the Colonies. So, we just watched a nice video that was a good summary of life in the colonies, so let's start talking specifics. The population in the colonies, well, it grew pretty fast. It went from 250,000 in 1700 to 2.5 million a mere 70 years later. Now, there are a few big reasons for this. First, a lot of people kept moving there. It's sort of like a new neighborhood popped up, and we hear it's pretty swell there, so everyone's going there. When people move from one country to another and they plan on staying permanently, that is called immigration. Now, another factor that led to such a population explosion was that colonial families were large. This is because New England was a pretty healthy place to live compared to, say, London and other places in Europe. Babies and mothers survived more often. Even so, death was a far more common occurrence in colonial times. Medicine just isn't what it is today, and epidemics, which are essentially outbreaks of disease, were a semi-regular event. So, a lot of people moving in, a lot of people having babies, and a lot of babies and mommies surviving. Despite the American colonies being a smorgasbord, if you know what smorgasbord is, good for you. If you don't, there's a link. So despite the American colonies being a smorgasbord of people, they began to meld together. The colonists were not so much Germans, a Jew, Englishmen, as they were becoming Americans. They adapted their customs to fit their new life in America and developed a spirit of independence. An American culture developed. Education, art, and religion were important parts of this culture. But at the heart of America, and in this humble man's opinion remains at the heart of American culture, is the family. Moving on to that topic of the colonial family unit. So, men ran the colonial household. They mostly worked all the time. They ran the farm or the shop and built the homes, barns, stables, etc. They were essentially laborers. That is not to say that the wives did not do any work. Quite the opposite. They did a ton of work. It was just different work. They ran the household and raised all the children. For any of you that had any experience with domestics, you know that is no easy task. Children are crazy. Imagine having 5 of them all at the same time. And no vacuum cleaner or running water, or Mr. Clean Scrubbies, or Comet, or anything, no Windex, stuff like that. Women even worked alongside men in the fields from time to time. Unmarried women might work as maids or cooks. Some women even ran businesses, like women that never got married, or widows. Yes, widows. But even if they were running a business or owned property, they could not vote. The sons might work as apprentices, working with skilled craftsmen to learn a trade. And then daughters were pretty much raised to be wives, domestic, things like that. And we're going to talk a little bit about education. Here we have the family. These folks look rich. And look at all those kids. The pretty pink dresses. Okay, education in the colonies varied regionally. Our last textbook actually went in a lot more detail on this, so I added some of that in here. So if you see something that's not in your textbook, that's why. In New England, as we've established, Puritans, those kind of folk, they were very religious. As such, laws were passed in 1647 in Massachusetts, establishing the basis for what would become really the first public education system. They wanted all the children to be able to read so that they could read the Bible. In the middle colonies, the only schools they had were private, so they were slightly less educated than they were in New England. In the South now, for quite a long time, the only children to get educated were those of the plantation upper class, and they were generally taught by private tutors. So really, the 3 regions had 3 different types of education. In New England, it was mostly mandatory. The law said that any town with 50 or more families had to have a school that was paid for by taxes. So the school was built, and then the teacher was paid with taxes. Like we said, New England, or rather the middle colonies, places like Pennsylvania, New York, they had private schools. like dame schools. A lot of people would be sent to school, but a lot of people weren't. But they were far more frequent than they were in the South, where the only people that got educated were basically kids of rich kids, and it's not so much that they had schools, but they had the money to hire private tutors so their kids could learn. Okay, religion was a major part of the colonies. A religious event occurred in the 1700s called the Great Awakening. It was a time when religious revival swept through the colonies, and you had these preachers that were great orators, basically traveling through the country giving sermons. Some examples of these men would be like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. During this time, new sects of churches sprouted up. So before there was like church A, B, and C, now there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. All these churches popped up. This movement actually helped to unite the colonies under a common experience. Basically, this means like this event is happening in the whole country, and now it was something we all have in common. This helped revolutionary ideas spread in the not-so-distant future. Another thing that they discuss in the book, but I didn't really hit so much in this lesson, is that this was a time when people sort of stopped listening to the established church and stopped saying, well, this is what the church says, so it must be true, and they really looked to their inner self for faith. So that's where all these new religions popped up. Bob over here says, you know what, I don't really like what this church is saying. I think that my way of doing worship is best, and you know what, they're not the authority. I'm as much authority on the Bible as they are. I'm making my own church. So it was sort of a anti-establishment sentiment, more individual oriented. So hey, that would also help to spread revolutionary ideas in the future. Another event occurred during these times, a sort of scientific awakening, if you will. It was called the Enlightenment. It was a time when people started doing experiments and understanding the world around them, and a lot of science. The Enlightenment helped to spread the ideas of freedom and equality. One famous Enlightenment thinker in the colonies that you may have heard of was Benjamin Franklin. There's not too much on the Enlightenment, but there's a good bit on this last topic we're going to hit. On the topic of thought and freedom. Freedom of the press was an issue at the front and center of the colonies in 1733. You see, we have newspapers in the major cities, and much of the colonies were still like royal colonies, so they had people from Britain appointed to govern them. They weren't representative of the colonists so much. And so you have these newspapers printing political commentary, and it was not always kind to these British appointments, such as the governor. And this was the case in the trial of John Peter Zenger. You see, John Peter Zenger had a newspaper in New York, and he was the publisher, and he had a piece published that accused the governor of New York, an appointment of the king, of corruption. And the governor had him put in jail. And it went to trial, and Zenger said, I can print this because it's true. And the jury, still, we know that even the British believe in trial by jury. They basically, he was set free. They found him not guilty. And this was a big deal. It's been in every history book I've ever read, because it was really a huge step for freedom of the press to be able to print stuff that's not necessarily good about government officials and not be punished for it, as long as it's true. If it's not true, that's a crime, that's libel. Okay, so all of these events, like the Great Awakening, the Enlightenment, freedom of the press, they were part of a new concept, and we'll call it civic virtue. That's what it's called in the book. Basically, people were thinking about what it means to be free and how a free society would be an awesome place to live. Civic virtue. Sort of an obtuse concept. But that's it. On the next page is your assignment for the day. Read the directions, and you should be good. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great day.